First, we want to consider objections to the form of the argument. So, objection number one. Craig says that he believes in God on the basis of the self-authenticating witness of the Holy Spirit in his heart, not on the basis of the Kalam cosmological argument. In fact, he says that even if the argument were refuted, he would still believe in God. This is blatant hypocrisy on Craig's part. Response to objection number one. The problem with this objection is that even if I were a hypocrite, there's just no relationship between the soundness of an argument and the psychological state of the person propounding it. The objector is thus guilty of putting forth a textbook example of an argument ad hominem. That is to say, trying to invalidate a position by attacking the character of the person who defends it. So what does make for a sound deductive argument? The answer is true premises and valid logic. True premises and valid logic. An argument is sound if the premises of the argument are true and the conclusion follows from the premises by the rules of logic. The soundness of the Kalam cosmological argument is thus entirely independent of me. The argument was, after all, defended by the medieval Muslim theologian Al-Ghazali 1,000 years before I was born. If the argument is sound, it was sound then. If the argument is sound, it was sound during the Jurassic period, before anyone had propounded it. My alleged hypocrisy just has nothing to do with the soundness of the argument. Now, to be a good argument, the argument must admittedly be more than merely sound. If the premises of an argument are true, but we have no evidence for the truth of those premises, then the argument will not be a good one. It may, unbeknownst to us, be sound, but in the absence of any evidence for the premises, it won't, or at least shouldn't, convince anyone. The premises have to have some kind of epistemic warrant for us in order for a sound argument to be a good argument. Now, I've argued that what is needed is that the premises need to be not only true, but more plausible than their opposites, or negations. If it is more plausible that a premise is true in light of the evidence rather than false, then we ought to believe the premise. Now, plausibility is, to a certain degree, person relative. Some people may find a premise more plausible than its opposite, while others may not. In that sense, the goodness of an argument is not wholly independent of people's psychological states. In the case of the Kalam cosmological argument, I do in fact find the premises more plausible than their opposites, and therefore I'm convinced that it is a good argument. I just don't regard the argument as the basis for my belief in God. And I've been quite candid about that. My belief in God is a properly basic belief grounded in the inner witness of God's Holy Spirit. And I find it odd that rather than being commended for my candor, I'm accused of hypocrisy. I've elsewhere defended the proper basicality of belief in God on the basis of the Spirit's witness, but that's quite unnecessary here, for even if I were entirely mistaken about that, it would have no bearing on the worth of the Kalam cosmological argument. To illustrate the point, suppose I believe that Abraham Lincoln was one of the greatest of the American presidents. And in order to convince you of this, I present to you the testimony of expert historians, along with a detailed account of Lincoln's amazing accomplishments. But suppose that the real reason that I think Lincoln was so great is because he had a beard. And I once had a beard, and therefore am prejudiced in favor of bearded presidents. Obviously, my personal prejudice would have no bearing whatsoever upon the worth of the evidence for Lincoln's greatness. Similarly, whatever reason I have personally for believing in God, whether it's the witness of the Holy Spirit or the ontological argument or the teleological argument or divine revelation or whatever, that just has no relation to the soundness or the worth of the Kalam cosmological argument. The skeptic may not like my taking belief in God as properly basic, but that's not a criticism of the Kalam cosmological argument. That's at best a rejection of proper basicality of belief in God, which has simply no bearing on the worth of the Kalam argument. Bad objection number 2. The Kalam cosmological argument is question-begging. For the truth of the first premise presupposes the truth of the conclusion. Therefore, the argument is an example of reasoning in a circle. Response to number 2. All the objector has done is describe the nature of a deductive argument. In a deductive argument, the conclusion is implicit in the premises, waiting to be derived by the logical rules of inference. A classic illustration of a deductive argument is the following. 1. All men are mortal. 2. Socrates is a man. 3. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. This argument has the same logical form as the Kalam cosmological argument. In fact, this form of the argument even has a name. It's called modus ponens. Symbolically, it looks like this. P implies Q, P, therefore, Q. This is one of the most basic and important, logically valid argument forms. Incredibly, however, I have actually seen claims by internet critics that this argument about Socrates being mortal is also question-begging. Now, this raises the question of what it means for an argument to be question-begging. Technically, arguments don't beg the question. People do. One is guilty of begging the question if one's only reason for believing in a premise is that one already believes in the conclusion. For example, suppose you were to present the following argument for the existence of God. 1. Either God exists or the moon is made of green cheese. 2. The moon is not made of green cheese. 3. Therefore, God exists. Now, this is a sound argument for God's existence. Its premises are both true, and the conclusion follows from the premises by the rules of logic, specifically disjunctive syllogism. Nevertheless, the argument is not any good because your only reason for believing the first premise to be true is that you already believe that God exists. A disjunction like premise 1 is true if one of the disjuncts is true. But the belief that God exists is the conclusion of the argument. Therefore, in putting forward this argument, you are reasoning in a circle or begging the question. The only reason you believe 1 is because you already believe 3. Now, neither the argument for Socrates' mortality nor the Kalam cosmological argument is like this. In both cases, reasons are given for believing the premise, which are quite independent of the argument's conclusion. Biological and medical evidence may be marshaled on behalf of the premise that all men are mortal. And I've presented arguments, which I'll review shortly, for the truth of the premise that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Therefore, I have not begged the question. The objector has made an elementary mistake of confusing a deductive argument with a question-begging argument.